My name is Michael, and at the time of my near-death experience, I was 42 and the regional sales director for a tech multinational. My life revolved around meetings and targets. On the day of my experience, I was in Singapore for another quarterly sales review and another set of endless presentations. The conference room we were in felt suffocating, even with its floor-to-ceiling windows. So, when the opportunity came to escape for a quick sailing excursion during our team-building day, I jumped at it. The South China Sea sparkled invitingly, a welcome break from spreadsheets and PowerPoint slides. I remember the boat rocking, the salty breeze cutting across my face. My colleagues were laughing, enjoying themselves. I'd always been the serious one, the one who worked through lunch, who answered emails at midnight. But today I decided to be spontaneous. "I'm jumping in," I announced, surprising even myself. The water was warmer than I expected, enveloping me in an instant. I hadn't bothered with a life vest, a decision that would soon reveal its consequences. The currents were stronger than they looked, pulling me away from the boat with surprising speed. At first, I wasn't worried. I was a good swimmer. I'd even been on swim teams back in college. But these waters were different. Each stroke became more difficult, each breath more desperate. The shoreline, which had seemed close, now appeared impossibly distant. Panic began to set in. My arms felt like lead, and my lungs were burning. I could hear the distant shouts coming from the boat, but they felt like they were from another world. The waves crashed over me, and I found myself swallowing salt water, struggling to keep my head above the surface. And then suddenly, I wasn't struggling anymore. The transition was instantaneous, yet somehow gradual. One moment I was fighting for air, my lungs burning with seawater, and the next I was looking down at myself. I floated above my own body, watching it drift limply in the currents, my face peaceful despite the desperate situation. Strangely, I felt no panic, no fear, only curiosity. My attention was drawn to my wristwatch, catching sunlight as my arm floated in the water. What happened next defies explanation. I wasn't just seeing my watch, I was inside it, observing its innermost workings with impossible clarity. The tiny gears and springs were no longer mechanical objects, but living components of an intricate universe. The moving parts glowed with an infrared hue that I somehow understood represented kinetic energy, while the stationary elements radiated an ultraviolet light of potential energy. I could see electrons jumping between atoms, could follow the flow of electrical current from the battery through the circuitry. This wasn't just visual. I comprehended the mathematics and physics behind each interaction, understood the relationship between mass and energy at a fundamental level that would have been impossible with my normal human mind. It was as though the universe had opened its instruction manual to me. When my awareness expanded again, I was back in the water, but now looking up from beneath the surface. The sunlight filtered through the water in beams of extraordinary beauty, creating patterns more complex and meaningful than I could have imagined. The light wasn't just illuminating the water, it seemed to be communicating something essential about existence itself. Then my perception shifted, and I looked down toward the ocean floor. What I saw wasn't merely darkness or sand, but an abyss of immense power. It was blackness beyond description. Not an absence of light, but a presence of something primordial and alive. At first, this vast darkness overwhelmed me with its immensity, but then it transformed into something profoundly comforting, like returning to a home I didn't know I had missed. The fear that should have accompanied such darkness was replaced by peace. As my consciousness adjusted to this new reality, I noticed a small wooden ship resting on the ocean floor. It resembled an old buccaneer vessel, perhaps placed there for tourists. But this mundane observation quickly gave way to something extraordinary. The ocean floor wasn't empty. It was a theatre of human experience spanning centuries. Before me appeared a procession of people, not as ghosts or apparitions, but as solid, living human beings in the process of drowning. I was witnessing drownings that had occurred in this very spot across different epochs of time. First came indigenous people, their expressions of terror and surprise etched into their faces as they struggled against the water. Then sailors in clothing from centuries past, pirates with weathered faces and tattered garments, women in their dresses, children from different eras, all experiencing their final moments in the same physical space I now occupied. They weren't memories or recordings, they were happening now, in a dimension where time existed differently. I could see approximately 40 individuals, each drowning in sequence, yet somehow simultaneously. More astonishing was my connection to them. I could feel their thoughts, experience their emotions, understand their lives. Their consciousness and mine were temporarily merged. A sailor from what appeared to be the 18th century passed near me, his eyes wide with terror, as he flailed against the inevitable. I knew immediately that he had fallen overboard during a storm, that he had a wife waiting in a port town, thousands of miles away, that his greatest regret was a promise unkept to his aging father. I knew this not as information, but as direct experience. His memories were temporarily mine. Among this parade of souls, one figure captured my attention completely. A pregnant woman in a long white dress that appeared to be from the early 1900s. Her brown hair flowed around her in the water like a halo. Unlike the others, she wasn't struggling or fighting against death. Her hands cradled her swollen belly protectively. Her entire being focused on the child she carried rather than her own fate. When our eyes met, something unprecedented happened. She saw me. Her thoughts entered my mind. "What are you doing here observing?" The directness of this communication startled me. How could she perceive me when I was merely witnessing these events? Her eyes held mine with a fierce intensity. In that gaze was a reflection of all human experience. Love, fear, protection, sacrifice, acceptance. She knew she was dying, yet her concern remained solely for her unborn child. I felt humbled and intrusive, a voyeur in this most intimate moment of transition. Is this really happening to me? I thought, and somehow she received this question. The connection between us formed a bridge, and suddenly I understood. I was not just an observer. I was now part of this eternal moment, this continual cycle of life and death. Now I am one of them, I realised. This recognition triggered something new. My own life began to play out before me, not as a linear film, but as simultaneous experiences. I revisited significant moments from my past, but not as memories. I was there living them again, while simultaneously observing myself. I attended my college graduation, held my newborn daughter for the first time, experienced my first heartbreak, all while floating in this timeless ocean space. Through this re-experiencing, I learned things about myself I had never realised. Patterns of behaviour, missed opportunities for kindness, moments of courage I had forgotten. It was like reading a biography of myself written by someone who knew me better than I knew myself. Then bitter reality crashed in. I thought of my family, my daughters who needed a father, my wife who would be devastated, my elderly mother who had already endured so much loss. Grief overwhelmed me, not for my own death, but for the pain my absence would cause. The thought of never seeing my children grow up, never holding my wife again, never telling my mother how much I appreciated her sacrifices. It was unbearable. In this moment of deepest despair, everything changed again. The dark waters surrounding me began to glow with a luminous warmth. It wasn't light as we understand it, it was more like love made visible. This radiance pushed back the darkness, creating a space of pure comfort and acceptance. Fear and sadness dissolved completely, replaced by a joy so intense it would have shattered my physical body. I felt myself expand beyond any concept of individual identity, becoming part of something vast and loving. The boundaries between myself and everything else disappeared. I was connected to all the drowning souls I had witnessed, to my living family members, to every particle of the universe. We were one unimaginably complex organism, pulsing with the same life force. Time ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Past, present, and future operated all at once, revealing a reality far more complex and beautiful than I had ever imagined. Everything, every joy, every suffering, every mundane moment, an extraordinary event, made perfect sense within this tapestry. There were no accidents, no random occurrences, only a perfect unfolding of infinite potentials. In this state of perfect understanding, I found myself transported to my home. I was sitting atop a ladder, looking down at my two daughters playing on the floor. One was 7, the other 5, both absorbed in a game involving stuffed animals and building blocks. The older one was showing her sister how to construct a tower, patiently guiding her small hands. I could see the sunlight catching in their hair, could hear the exact timbre of their giggles. This wasn't a memory or a vision. I was there experiencing a moment of perfect contentment, understanding that all was right with them. The scene shifted and I was in my mother's shop. She was arranging merchandise on shelves, her grey hair tied back in its familiar bun, her hands moving with the efficiency of decades of practice. I felt a stab of concern about how my death would affect her. She had already lost my father years ago, and as her only child, my death would be devastating. I wanted to reach out, to assure her that I was still here in some form, that she would not be alone. But I could only observe as she went about her day, unaware of my presence or the tragedy that awaited her. Then came the most puzzling experience of all. I found myself in an unfamiliar living room, sitting across from Alan, my childhood friend who had died 5 years earlier in a car accident. He looked exactly as I remembered him, slightly dishevelled hair, crooked smile, the scar above his right eyebrow from when we crashed our bikes racing as teenagers. "You wouldn't believe how hard it's been, Mike," he was saying, as if continuing a conversation we'd been having for hours. "Since the company downsized, I've been working 2 jobs to keep up with the mortgage. Jessica's mom moved in last month, which helps with the kids, but the house feels so crowded now." He spoke about financial difficulties, about considering a night security job after his day work. I listened, bewildered, until I couldn't contain my confusion any longer. "Alan," I interrupted, "you can't be working 2 jobs. You can't be worried about mortgages. You died 5 years ago. The car accident on Highway 18, remember?" He looked at me with genuine confusion, shaking his head. "No, man, you must have dreamed that. I'm very much alive." He laughed, though there was uncertainty in his eyes. The scene was so convincingly real that I began to doubt my own memories. Had I imagined his death? Had the funeral, the grief, the support group for his widow? Had all that been some bizarre dream? In this state of confusion, I heard a distant voice cutting through the ethereal landscape. "Michael! Michael, can you hear me?" The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Michael! Are you okay?" Suddenly I was back in my body, gasping for air, my hands grasping desperately at a rocky outcrop jutting from the water. My colleague David was swimming toward me, concern etched on his face. In his hand was my lost swimming shoe. I'm not okay," I managed to say between laboured breaths. "Just hold on," he said. "We'll get you back to the boat." When I finally rejoined my colleagues on the vessel, I was met with a mixture of concern and relief that quickly turned to light-hearted teasing. "Anything to get out of tomorrow's presentation, right?" joked Lee from marketing. "Man, you were gone for like 15 minutes, added Tara. "We were about to send out the search party when David spotted you." 15 minutes. The experience that had felt like lifetimes had occurred in just 15 minutes of earthly time. I smiled weakly at their jokes, unable to articulate what had happened. How could I explain that I had witnessed centuries of deaths, experienced the universe from inside a wristwatch, and conversed with a dead friend? How could I convey the sensation of being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, of understanding the fundamental interconnectedness of all existence? That night in my hotel room, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pregnant woman's gaze, felt the warmth of that luminous water, experienced again the sensation of perfect oneness. I called home, needing desperately to hear my family's voices. "Michael, do you know what time it is here?" my wife asked, her voice thick with sleep. "I just needed to hear your voice," I said. "And the girls, are they okay?" "They're fine, just like they were when you called yesterday." "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I lied. "Just a long day." "What did the girls do today?" "Emma has a math test and Lily's working on a school project. They're building models of the solar system." As my wife spoke and shared details of their day, I realised what I'd seen when my girls were playing had really happened. I had been there with them in that moment. I felt a chill run through me. The next morning I went through the motions of attending meetings and presentations, but my mind was elsewhere. During a break I found a quiet corner and searched for information about my friend Alan on my phone. The obituary was still there, the date of his death exactly as I remembered. Yet he had spoken to me about current struggles, about financial difficulties his family faced. On an impulse, I called his widow, Jessica. "Michael, this is unexpected," she said. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, I was thinking about Alan and wanted to check in. How are you managing?" There was a pause. "It's still hard, especially financially. Alan's life insurance wasn't enough to cover the mortgage long term. I've been thinking about taking a second job." My heart raced. "And your mother? Is she helping with the kids?" "How did you know?" "Mom moved in last month. The house is crowded, but she's a godsend with the children when I'm working." I ended the call shortly after, my mind reeling. Somehow, in that space between life and death, I had accessed information that I couldn't possibly have known. Alan had communicated genuine concerns about his family, concerns that were playing out in reality, even after his death. In the weeks that followed, I began to research near-death experiences to try to understand what had happened. And while part of me understood that my experience was probably just an hallucination caused by oxygen deprivation, it felt a lot more than that. It felt like a glimpse into a reality that exists alongside our own. A reality where time is fluid, where consciousness transcends physical boundaries, where the distinction between life and death is not as absolute as we believe. 6 months after the incident, I left my corporate position for a role with a non-profit organisation. My colleagues thought I was having a midlife crisis, sacrificing a lucrative career for work that paid less but aligned more closely with my values. Perhaps they were right, but it didn't matter. I had experienced something that had permanently altered my perception of what constitutes a life well lived. I also began researching similar experiences, finding comfort and validation in the accounts of others who had temporarily crossed the threshold between worlds. The specific details varied, but certain elements remained consistent. The sense of perfect peace, the experience of oneness, the understanding that love is the fundamental force of existence. Hate, jealousy, fear, these are constructs of our limited perception. Love, I learned, is the only constant. It expands, encompasses, connects. It is both the medium and the message of existence. A door opened that day, revealing a reality that had always existed but remained unseen. And for that glimpse beyond the veil, I remain eternally grateful.